Hi, everyone. Welcome to session 5 of the annual meeting. If I can get these slides to advance. There we go. So just a few housekeeping items. We wanted to remind you that the conversation today will be recorded and we'll have it available afterwards on the website. You can find the agenda and all of the speaker bios for our panelists on the website under the resources tab. Just a reminder that if you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the Q&A box. It should be in the bottom corner of your screen. And then also, if you would like to join the Collaboratory, you can email us at cdrc@cpac.org. And if you have any questions or issues that pop up because it's WebEx, please feel free to email Kitty at kbog@cpac.org. And I will go ahead and pass it off to Marco.
Unmute, Marco.
Of course, this is day 3, and yeah, I forgot my mute button, the first one. But I was just saying that I'd like to thank everyone for participating, both as a panelist and especially the participants coming in. I see that they're still coming on as we're talking, and I'm the executive director of the Cure Drug Repurposing Collaboratory, and over the past few days, we've been talking about some disease-specific context issues with the Collaboratory, and today we're really starting on more of the technical pieces. This is a public-private partnership funded by the FDA, and we work very closely with FDA and CATS, one of the 27 institutes at NIH. CDRC is actually part of the Critical Path Institute. For those of you who don't know, we're a nonprofit organization based in Tucson, Arizona. This is a fairly young consortia. We're initiated back in 2020, but CPATH itself has roughly about 15 years of experience working on a number of different areas, crossing both data analytics, the interaction with regulatory agencies, and more specifically with working with pharma. This particular consortia or Collaboratory is really focused on capturing real-world data in order to generate hypotheses that can be used to identify efficacy signals for existing drugs, especially when those drugs are used for new indications. And that's really where a lot of the content for this particular session is going to really rely on. We're obviously interested in real world data. One of the major sources that we're looking at is electronic health records and how to be able to extract that data in an efficient and also including a quality metric associated with it to be able to make some informed decisions on next steps, and whether that's being able to utilize real-world evidence, for example, to supplement an RCT application for submission, or more importantly, to be able to inform how RCTs should be designed in the future to extract the best amount of information from the clinical trial. So we have a couple of panel discussions this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are. This is really going to be an exciting series of conversations. The first panel will be for about an hour and a half, then we'll have a 10-minute break, and then we'll have another panel discussion. I hope that to hear from you. So again, there's a question and answer box. Please feel free to utilize that as best as you can, and feel free to ask the panelists questions. We'll be interjecting those questions throughout this discussion period. And with that, I'll pass this over to Smith and Asen. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Marco. I'm Dr. Smith Hevner. I am the Scientific Director for the Cure Drug Repurposing Collaboratory. and I'll be your moderator today. Just to give a brief touch about my background, I'm a registered nurse specializing in critical care and emergency medicine. Through the pandemic, I transitioned into an informaticist researcher role, and over a course of several advantageous events, made my way to being part of CDRC. I want to give each our co-moderator and each of our panelists a chance to introduce themselves. Unfortunately, one of our panelists, Dr. Matt Robinson of Johns Hopkins University, won't be able to join us today due to a family emergency. But I'm going to turn first to Dr. Ison Taken and from the Mayo Clinic and ask her to introduce herself, please.
Hi, my name is Aysun, and I'm a infectious diseases physician by training, and I have been working as a research fellow at Mayo Clinic for the last 1.5 years. And I have been heavily involved with the virus registry since its very beginning. And today I'm very excited to be hearing about registry development from its experts and learn from their experiences. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Dr. Taken. Dr. Kashyap.
Happy to be here today. My name is Dr. Rahul Kashyap. I'm a physician scientist specialized in acute and critical care research for the last 15 years, and I had a privilege and pleasure to be co-leading the virus COVID-19 registry led by Society of Clinical Care Medicine Discovery as well as Mayo Clinic, along with Dr. Ellen Walkie from Boston University and Dr. Vishaka Kumar from Society of Clinical Care Medicine. I'm super excited to hear other panelists and answer questions and then probably share my insights from the registry, the data standardization, automation, and whatever come our way. Happy to be here.
Thank you, Dr. Kashyap. Dr. Nagy.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for having me here. I am Paul Nagy. I am a faculty member and informaticist at Johns Hopkins University. I'm the program director for our informatics and data science training program. And I also lead our Odyssey efforts for taking our clinical data at Johns Hopkins and using it for research purposes. Yeah, and I serve on the steering committee for Odyssey, so it's really a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Dr. Nagy. Dr. Merson?
Smith, very nice to be here, and thanks very much for having me. My name is Laura Merson. I'm an academic based at the University of Oxford, and I specialize in infectious diseases data, particularly emerging infections. My background has been in clinical trials for most of my career. And after running trials, I specialized in trials in difficult settings, mostly in Sri Lanka, Vietnam, across sub-Saharan Africa. And I realized there was so much more that we could do with all this data that we were collecting. And so based at Oxford now, I'm interested in pursuing that and hopefully working with all of you. Thanks.
Thank you. And last but not least, Dr. Rowe, and I believe we have some slides that Dr. Rowe is going to talk about as part of his introduction.
Okay. Thank you. I'm Matthew Rowe. I'm the Chief Medical Officer of Rana Health, which is a health technology company located in the United States that partners with medical professional societies to help enable their nationwide quality improvement registries. So I have a 20-year experience working at the Duke Clinical Research Institute on cardiovascular clinical trials and registries with several different cardiovascular professional societies. And I'm looking forward to talking today about how reusable data and technology infrastructure can power registries of the future and also meet the goals and objectives that we have to try to vanquish the pandemic and also advance the objectives of CDRC. So I'm looking forward to the conversation today.
And do we have Dr. Rowe's slides for him to go over, Pam?
Yeah, I'm just going to briefly present a few points here just to kind of level set a little bit on some of the we're all facing, but the solutions that we've also been developing. So let's go to the next slide. We are actually really fortunate to be partnering with 3 different medical professional societies in ophthalmology, neurology, and urology to actually help them grow their nationwide quality improvement rate populated by EHR data to accelerate research, advance quality reporting on behalf of all the practices, and really change how data can be used and reused for multiple different purposes. Next slide. This is just some data from the registries that we are supporting through these partnerships. Each of these registries has a national footprint across the United States with thousands of different contributing providers and thousands of also contributing practices. We are integrating technically with any EHR platform used in the United States, and there are many, as you well know, being able to either pull or have them push data to us in a way that we can then map those data to different common data models, curate them, and then do the MIPS reporting on practices for Medicare quality reporting purposes, but then also power observational research and prospective clinical trial research. Next slide. So this is just an example of the technology platform. We can actually extract data from the source EHRs. We can also extract image data. The EHRs obviously include a lot of notes data, so we're getting those in full and complete form. And then we're also linking to claims data through different data partnerships. Those data come into the platform, they're cleaned, they're normalized to fit for purpose common data models for each specialty. And then we apply curation services that are informatics-based solutions, similar to the ones that are used in health system partnerships for the structured data, but then also a lot of work on the unstructured notes data using natural language processing, machine learning, up through manual curation of data sets to test, train, and validate those models. And then we developed disease-specific data modules that provide all the platform for then doing observational research, powering clinical trials, doing quality reporting, and advancing the scientific research goals of the societies. And while this is being done, we're developing a unique data quality framework to look at every step of data as they move through the pipeline, to look for concerns about data quality, try to solve them early rather than later, and then do that across the board in a scalable fashion. And this is exactly in line with what the FDA RWE guidance is asking for. Next slide. This is just an example of the different types of solutions we developed. So for the societies and the providers, the data that we're curating in these partnerships advances all their research objectives and leads to a large amount of scientific dissemination. We do the quality reporting for the sites. We have solutions and options for the sites to use their data to help them identify patients in their practices for inclusion in clinical trials in a much more streamlined and efficient way. And then we partner with life sciences companies to help design and execute their clinical trials and answer observational research questions using the de-identified data. Next slide. And the key here, I think, for any of these registries that we're talking about is that we provide value back to the contributing providers or health entities that are contributing the data. In the setting that we are working in, it's mostly community practices. So we have several different value propositions that are shown in this slide for the data that they are contributing to us on a regular basis, anchored on the quality reporting for the MIPS program, but having clinical trial solutions, practice management solution, and ability for them to actually look into their practice, identify treatment gaps or areas that they want to work on for quality improvement, and then follow that in time and see the impact of different interventions that they may use. And then next slide. Finally, the key here for any of these types of registry efforts, I think, is to do something bigger in a network type of approach that can also be used going forward for other purposes. And so by connecting these sites and getting data contributions on a regular basis, we have multiple opportunities for them to be part of new and emerging research opportunities, such as prospective observational cohort studies. We provide support and professional education for the contributing practices and their staff. We give them involvement in all the scientific dissemination activities on behalf of the societies, and we can help them participate more efficiently in clinical trials. And so as we think about registries and where they sit in the value chain and how we can reuse data that are generated in routine practice with technology approaches to actually manage those data and curate them in a way that's valuable, I think there's a lot of opportunities in the future, and we need unique data partnerships to really achieve our goals, because no one single data source is going to answer all the questions that we have. So with that in mind, I'll finish my presentation. I appreciate the chance to present and be involved, and look forward to a robust discussion.
Thank you very much, Matthew. A number of our other panelists have also recorded sessions prior to this panel discussion. But we felt Matthew's presentation would help give a nice broad overview of all the concepts that we're going to be talking about today. I encourage you, if you haven't already, go onto our website and review those recordings. And then again, this panel discussion will also be available in a recording afterwards if you want to go back and review anything. I want us to kind of start at the beginning. We have represented on this call a number of different registries that have been developed, some of them developed very, very quickly with very little resources to help us address and understand the COVID-19 pandemic as it was emerging. I want to start with the discussion around how do we actually determine what variables to select? How do we start even deciding what information do we need to be capturing when there's so little known about a disease? And I think, Rahul, I'd love to hear from you about the development of the virus registry and how you all went about selecting variables.
I can never get sick of answering that question, Smriti. It's too close to my heart. And there are so many people, especially Dr. Merson and others can chime in, including Dr. Taken. So data selection has been a problem. We learned through Ebola experience, and we were not involved in any of those planning at the time, that it took us as a country like more than 9 months to decide what kind of data points we want. We're talking about 2014 and 15. So since then, I hope Dr. Kumar is in the audience. We created this task force or work group called C2D2, Critical Care Data Dictionary, within SCCM Discovery Part. And our task was to identify these variables, have a consensus through Delphi process, and basically have an operational definition consensus. So we are in the middle of those discussions, kind of launching a registry to test those variables in sepsis in 2020 June. And when, unfortunately, COVID-19 hit, we kind of repurposed that approach. I realized that, sepsis, ARDS, pneumonia, shock, these are bread and butter in ICU, but that's the exact same thing people have it with COVID-19. So the buckets of chronic medical conditions, demographic, process of care, and outcome, these are the 4 buckets. We use it, and I'm sure everybody knows, even in clinical trial, real world data, or registry, these buckets of 4 where chronic disease management, chronic disease, comorbidities, demographics, process of care, and outcome. If you cover a highly valued data points from there, that kind of covers like 80 to 90% grounds. And of course, you have to be a little bit specific, as Dr. Tekin can mention, that we, as the literature keep coming out, we keep updating our database to include some of the things which we were not thinking, or it was not in our radar. So it is a dynamic process, but idea is to keep it prepared, have the consensus and Delphi done before or in peacetime, so you're ready for the wartime or during the pandemic.
Thank you, Rahul. Aysen and Laura, any comments?
I'm happy to jump in. So our process was quite different, and I'll have to give you just a little bit of background, I guess, to contextualize that. And to start by saying, so I work with ISARC at the University of Oxford, and ISARC is not a patient registry, and we don't run a patient registry. So maybe I'm in the wrong panel, but what we do is we specialize in preparedness and operationalization of outbreak research response. So we have been working with the WHO for the last 10 years to develop standardized protocols for research response in outbreaks, and that includes case report forms. And what we developed after what I would call a global failure with respect to all of us in 2009 for the H1n1 pandemic, I think we failed to respond to that global pandemic, and the research response was abysmal. And to this day, we don't have good evidence on how to treat, certain populations with such diseases. And so as a result of that, we developed ISARC around H7n9 that was emerging in China in 2012, and the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome that was emerging right about the same time. And we said, what are the questions and how do we answer them? And so we poured time into determining specifically what variables we needed to collect. That was a very iterative approach. There were Delphi processes involved, but really what we developed was version 1, and I think now we're on version 267, because it changes and it iterates. And so what we did is we used that case report form, and then we got feedback and we made it better. And we have rolled out this protocol and case report form in so many different contexts and diseases now, including Zika and Ebola, and within the UK where I sit, it is the national priority protocol for pathogens of public health importance. So that's been monkeypox, that's been anything that's shown up in the country has been enrolled to this. And we take all of that learning and we iterate and we develop and we make sure that we've got something that's there and that's flexible. But I'll come back to that flexibility point later. Oh, Smitty, hit your mute button and we'll hear you better.
It's just spreading from Marco. Matthew, any comments, because you also are dealing with multiple different registries? Any comment? We're hearing both that there's a need for this, having some sort of platform ready to go when the crisis emerges, as opposed to trying to play catch up. Any comments from your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think it takes technology to do this, right? And there has to be a financial model that can support that infrastructure development, but then you can actually scale and grow very quickly once you've done that for the next, emergency or the next initiative. And I think if you're looking at registries as ways where the sites actually have to enter the data into an electronic data capture platform and it's not being pulled directly from their routinely generated clinical care data, then it's hard, right? Because then you have to create a new case report form, you have to come up with new data standards, you have to do all these other things. Whereas if you take the data that are generated in routine practice and just learn how to extract them or push them into a common platform and then curate them, then you can actually add other things in an incremental, much lower cost. And if you want to collect some questions that aren't part of routine care, you can have an add-on, really simple EDC approach for that. And some registries need that, but you have to have it's almost like you're paving the highway and you're coming along again and you're just putting a new coat of asphalt on, but the hard work is actually putting that highway in the first place. And so that's the thing that I think trying to create something from scratch is difficult. And, really the majority of the data, I think, should be repurposed from those generated in routine care delivery.
That's an excellent point. And I think that's
Can I
Go ahead.
interrupt you and give a due credit to Dr. Merson as well? We cross-checked the virus registry CRF with ISRIC, and it was heavily influenced from there to make sure that we're not missing anything out. So I want to make sure that we give the due credit. And two, it was a very good marriage for a brief time, and then we divorced as new data points came in. I think Christina Diaz has asked a question. We kind of kept adding some of these specific data points as well. So I want to give a due credit in public forum that we were heavily influenced by ISRIC data, and we are very thankful that you had it in place for several years.
Yeah, pleasure. I'll just add to Christina's comment, maybe that's in the Q&A, if that's okay. We didn't know anything about COVID when we started. Of course, we'd seen many different severe acute respiratory illnesses, but this was different than anything before. And so what we needed to do was learn and iterate. And as a data person, I absolutely hate the other specify field. I mean, that is the worst part of any database. You can do nothing with it, right? So we try to omit those, but actually that's the most valuable. And it was in there that we saw loss of taste, and it started to pop up, and we thought this is a trend. And so we added it to the case report form, which rolls out internationally. We've got 1,700 sites now who are implementing this database. And so another one, of course, was vaccines. So which was irrelevant at the beginning of the outbreak, but later became very relevant. And even, flu vaccination is an important clinical question. And then, of course, variants. So you have to stay dynamic, flexible, and things need to iterate with respect to an emerging infection.
And I believe the questions in the chat are sometimes hard for all attendees to see, so I do want to read Christina's question. She says, Dr. Kashyap, you mentioned it's a dynamic process of determining variables that are necessary in these registries. I'm curious, what are some of the variables you realized later on that you first missed? And I think our panelists have done a great job of addressing that. Rahul also provided a comment in the chat. Again, if you use the Q&A function, then all attendees will be able to see your questions. And we also have the opportunity for panelists to respond directly to those questions in chat. Please keep those questions coming. This is fantastic. Yes.
May I? Sorry, but I think an interesting point, and I'd be really interested how both of you are dealing with it, is it's great to add variables, and it's really easy to add variables, but how do you take them off? Because travel, which was critical in the beginning of the outbreak, became absolutely irrelevant fairly quickly. And so we don't any longer need to burden clinical staff or anyone else with the collection of those data, nor do we really want them or can do anything useful with them. And so I'm interested in others' experience of how do we reduce the case report form or data collection.
Excellent question.
Dr. Tekin, you can answer, or I can answer as well. There are multiple ways, but what we learned through REDCap CRF, you can actually disable some of the data points. You don't lose the already collected data, but going forward, it will not show up. And I'm sure there are multiple ways. I don't know if Dr. Tekin or Dr. Hafner, you have any other comments?
Mostly we have been using the method that you mentioned, Dr. Kashyap. We just somehow, we keep the data, but we somehow, do not keep collecting it, conceal it.
And this may be a great opportunity to bring in Paul. Paul recorded a presentation on a tool that lets us extract data from the electronic health record, which several of our panelists have talked about using that clinically generated data as kind of your baseline and then augmenting it with other data sources. Paul, I'd love to hear your thoughts on getting the data out of the EHR and also dealing with these issues of trying to add additional data points or omitting data points that are no longer relevant as we move forward.
Yeah, thank you so much, Smitty. So the first thing is I feel like we're in a moment when how we collect data for registries, and we're going through a big transition from the old traditional way of doing it manually, and we realize that it is very inefficient, it's very time consuming, and it has data quality issues associated with it. And so at Johns Hopkins, we support 160 clinical registries. We have over 60 FTEs of staff that are going around looking at charts and filling out these forms. And so this is a ripe and prime environment for being able to do automation. And I think there's some questions like loss of taste that are things that you want to be able to be flexible about and be able to add new questions as you go. But at the same time, a lot of the case review form can be captured from standard parts of the medical record. The symptoms the patients are having, the diagnosis codes, lab results on the tests for COVID. And so what we're seeing is what we want to avoid duplication, where someone has to look into an electronic medical record and then fill out a form on another website to be able to add that case report for that patient. And so the questions are, how do we harness all the data we're now collecting within an EMR? And it's now enormous amounts of data on medical images and sequencing and waveform and all of the procedures and medications that patients are having. How do we harness that in a standardized way so that we can help at least feed the backbone of a lot of registries and avoiding a lot of the both the time and effort it takes to do chart reviews, as well as eliminate some of the data quality issues around that. And so that's really been our big effort, is to take advantage of a common data model. As most electronic medical records are proprietary in their data models, they're very complex. They may have over 10,000 tables. So there's a large initiative throughout, there's a large global initiative to have a fairly standardized common data model for representation of a medical record. And that is called the Odyssey, or the Observational Health Science Informatics and Data Science Community. And with that, they have created a common data model, which now has over 800 million patients throughout the world mapped to that model. And so I do feel like this has been a big effort to help us to do that. So I feel like, yeah, we're seeing now is if we can help work with registries, and if 80% of what they're looking for is already captured electronically as part of routine clinical care, then what we can do is, and then you can build out specific, as Matthew talked about, we can build out specific NLP pipelines for looking for specific issues around signs and symptoms at time of admission, or other things that you've required chart reviews around. But this enables us not just to get the points of data, but this allows us to actually bring in a lot more data. So when we're looking for adverse events for medications, we now can capture all the labs or all the medications, or without having where once we have it standardized to a common terminology, it becomes a lot easier to be able to scale up the amount of data we can transfer in common format. So I feel it helps us address some of the discoverability issues of being able to trying to figure, the challenges is when you design a registry, you're constrained by the questions that you have at the time you create the registry. and in terms of what data you're asking for. And that's what I think Laura was talking about, is how do you be able to shift those questions as you go, as you learn more from your registry to be able to tailor your data. And with being able to tap into an EMR data stream, we are a lot more flexible in future-proofing the types of questions we'll be looking for as registries evolve and we begin to answer questions from that data.
I see you're unmuted, Laura. Go ahead.
I'm happy to comment on anything. And Paul, I would appreciate your insights on what you can and cannot answer with EHR data. I absolutely agree. It's a direction that we should all head in. Significant progress has been made. I tend to operate in settings where EHRs don't exist in many cases, or there's very limited functionality, but I still think it's part of the solution. I'm really interested in, for example, symptoms at presentation. A doctor won't necessarily record on an EHR all that may be relevant when we're trying to build a case definition very early on in an emerging infection, because there's not necessarily a, do you have this, yes or no? All you get is the yeses, and you just get the yeses that the patient self-reports, or maybe that the doctor thinks to query about, but you definitively don't get all the no's so that you've got good denominator data. So with respect to, let's say, public health, important public health questions on emerging infections, do you think that there's any gaps in the way the EHR data is collected and therefore the research we can produce with it?
That is a really good question. One thing that's important to point out is even electronic medical record number is just a summarization of the encounter with the patients with providers. It's still often not the raw data. The raw data might be in a medical image. It might be off of a device. It might be not located directly into the EMR itself. I think Science of Symptoms at the time of presentation is a great example of that. We ended up doing a project where we were able to integrate our EMR into REDCap, where we would have chart reviewers look at the EMR notes within 48 hours of admission and look for some of those signs and symptoms. And we use that as a training model for our natural language processing. And so I do feel like when you're looking for, as you start developing more granular and specific questions, you do need to then take advantage of doing this type of supervised training activities. What I do want to point out is this has become a big barrier. The time it takes for providers to do this annotation of these reports is actually become a rate limiting step. And so there's been a lot of work in natural language processing and in medical imaging called active learning, where we actually, as you start annotating the chart based on the difficulty of the annotation you're doing, how complex it is, the negation, what you're looking for in the text, it can actually adapt. It can help you figure out how many charts you actually need to review to build an accurate measure of what you're looking for. So I agree about flexibility, because we're always looking for new phenotypes that help describe the progression of disease, and we always want to have be able to have access to the actual note to be able to extract that. But as we evolve, I do feel we're also seeing a lot more flexibility in building structured reporting tools within EMRs that can be more granular as well, without reducing productivity of providers at the same time. So I think we're seeing advancements in some usability of how do we have adaptive questions from providers that can be more structured, so that's not just a free field text field. So it's not just a narrative note that it can be an other. It actually is something that can help help that health system be more focused on learning and be able to use that data for either quality improvement or research purposes.
I think that's a really interesting point, actually, and this WHI SARIC case report form, I think what it aimed to serve as is sort of like people might know the concept of core outcome measures, which is a consensus around how we're going to measure whether or not a drug works in a clinical trial. And you decide what things will be measured so that we can then compare them across many trials. And that's what we were looking to develop, was a core set of variables to say, no matter what you collect, could you please include these things? Because this is what we think is really critical to be able to build the evidence base for those early questions that are very important in characterizing the disease, understanding who's at risk, looking at prognostic indicators, et cetera. The challenge that we had was in the variety of settings where we are focused. More than half of the data that's on the historic platform comes from low and middle income countries. And so I think that what you mentioned about having that basic structure, just sort of like a core variable set within EHRs, I think that's incredibly important to reinforce, because the volume of data that we receive is, I would say, directly related to the income level of the country or of the healthcare setting that we are dealing with. And so as sites reduce the volume of data that they're able to share or collect because of the resource limitations, it's important that we are able to give some guidance on what the most critical variables are, so that we together can most rapidly answer the questions that need to be answered. So I agree with that principle.
I'll just jump in for a second for the previous discussion as well. In terms of the manual data automation, and somewhere in between, I would absolutely agree in a sense that the demographics, the lab and vitals, and some of the length of hospital stay, ICU stay, those data, I think it's a sin not to do it electronically through EMR if there are resources, and then there's electronic medical record. And then, as Dr. Merson has mentioned, the symptoms and some of those things, even WHO scale now for COVID-19, we're still trying to automatize it, but those things are hard. And, we mostly rely on manual data collection to make sure the data quality is good, but there are ways we can, kind of speed it up as well. The third data sets, like sometimes these are derivatives, they're not directly there in EMR. And I just want to take a second to talk about it, especially, let's say, if you determine the intubation start time or start of the RRT time, or is it emergent intubation or not, some of those acute care areas, in a sense, the computable phenotype, and Dr. Naiji has mentioned about it, like derivation of some of those things, looking at the variables which can be a surrogate for this particular variable we are looking into. I think there is a growing body which is looking into it, and how can you automatize using automation through your EMR or manually collected data for whatever purposes, may it be vaccine development, may it be looking into outcomes and perfecting it. I think the derivation of or surrogate of some of these variables could be done through using machine learning, or especially first to supervised machine learning, then unsupervised machine learning, and going forward to look into it. So it's very important to understand that we can never be fully automatized, at least in today's days and era, or we can never be manual, but there's always a sweet spot to get a 80-20 rule, that 80% of the data points could be done with 20% of efforts, and we can keep spending time on getting the rest of it.
I think it's the purpose of biomedical research is to find new phenotypes that can subset patients. So that should always be our quest, is looking for a new test or looking for a new group of patients that respond differently to a treatment. I think what I've been amazed about in the past 5 years is how much we can do now with real world evidence and observational data from routinely collected clinical data, as long as we can standardize that into common terminologies. What we're seeing now is, there's ability to take, we now have a study where we've taken over 100 million patients' records and looking for second line medications for diabetes control to see what are the prevalence for different second line medications. And so when you start, one of the things machine learning and these deep learning techniques need, they need a lot of data. And often with small registries, it's very hard to get to the millions of patients we need to look for subtle effects for complex responses, and be able to look at that. So I do feel like there's a real opportunity to combine what we work on within a clinical registry with what we can learn on with just from observational research data coming out of these electronic medical record systems.
Yeah, I just wanted to second several things that Paul said, including what he just said. One of the challenges of trying to annotate and manually abstract data from the EHR is it's really costly, it's human resource intensive, you need tools and technology in order for the abstractors to do their work, and it's always on, and so you have to have a model that would pay for that if you're doing it for a registry purpose. And then whatever data system you're in, you're going to be biased based on the patients seen in that. If it's in a health system, are those patients representative of patients around the country, around the world who may have the same condition? So then you have to have a method to externally validate any NLP or machine learning model. And those require unique data that don't exist because most that hold data rights don't want to collaborate or actually allow someone to use their data for an external validation. So I think there are some fundamental challenges there. But the other thing that can be done is, most EHRs are populated by templated notes that are used in a department, a division, a healthcare setting like the emergency department. And many of the providers will use a templated note with some subtle customization. But there are ways, if you can actually show them value, to try to implement more standardized templates that then would collect the data up front in a way that's more meaningful and fit for the purposes that you have for research. But the providers have to know that's going to improve their clinical workflow. They're going to get some value out of doing it that way. And there's a way to do it. And so I think fundamentally what the field needs to do is to really think about clinical care delivery, how we could standardize some of the documentation during that with value be given back to their patients for doing so. And that can enable research objectives because, the part that I'm working on quite a bit in my company is really costly, really human intensive, and takes a long time. And so I think there are ways for it to really fundamentally changing how we collect data during routine care delivery and then carry that forward for research purposes.
Matthew, what you've touched on is the need for benefits or what's in it for me, or ideally around patient care and not specifically the data collector. And that to me speaks to automated reporting that takes the data that they put in, analyzes it in a way that's meaningful to them, to their patients, to their clinic, their setting, and sends it back to them. Are the initiatives that you or Paul perhaps are involved with, are you pursuing those? Is that a part of the pipeline?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we're trying to do, and we work actually a little bit with Ehr Vendors, because there are a lot of them in the United States, is how we can actually work with them on their local installation of the EHR system to have some more standardized templates and things around certain disease conditions and certain types of clinical settings. And we're piloting some of this right now, but the problem is the EHR vendors don't see that as part of their business model, and so to get them to play ball with this just takes a little bit of effort. But I think like within a health system, which is not the environment that we're working in, it might be easier to do because you have an enterprise EHR across multiple different hospitals, multiple different clinics, where you could actually test and deploy stuff if you have buy-in from leaders of departments or divisions. That might be the way to do it. But it is hard. It's almost a Herculean task to work with EHR vendors to get them to standardize things. So you really have to work with the users, I think, and how they integrate with that. So it's not an insurmountable challenge, but it's tough. And so I think probably we need some more proof points to show why it's valuable, and then others will fall in line if they can understand that it would also be financially viable for them to do so.
Yeah, and Matthew's correct. Within the health system, it's a little bit easier, although I think it has to come from the bottom up. And so what we do is, I feel this is a principal tenet of a learning health system, is that the physicians in the local clinic are the best ones suited to ask the questions for their patients. And so when we design a form for a provider to ask patients or for patients to fill out, one thing is that we can do, which is not often done, is when you ask a question, you can actually then link that question to a coded terminology. That's usually the gap that's missing, is that when we do a depression screening questionnaire, we don't know there's actually a link term that we can link it to, so it actually is a known piece of knowledge instead of just being a random variable name. And so the whole key is as we create questionnaires in an EMR, we're actually taking the time to say that this question is actually a standardized question across the industry, and we had coded that way so that when it flows through the EMR, we now know it actually is tied to this standard. And then if they ask at another institution, we now have a piece of generalizable knowledge. And so I think the last bridge that's not being done is that when we're building these forms at the point of care, we're actually often asking the same questions, but we're not then saying, I got this from the depression screening form, and I'm just copying it over instead of linking it to it, so that we actually know that it is generalizable knowledge. And so we're able to do it, but it's right now it's extra work to do. And I hope that as the future unfolds, that becomes more standard, where it's the default setting where you ask new questions. It helps you say that this is actually a standard question, not a new de novo question.
Smitty, if I can pick up on standard questions, first of all, actually, Matthew made a comment that people don't want to share their data. I just want to put it, all of the ISARC data is openly available for qualified researchers with a research question to apply for. So please check the website. If you need data to check your machine learning algorithms against, that's a great data set, more than 700,000 patients worldwide. So please consider it, because we all need to find solutions for low and middle income countries as well. It's supposed to sort of high income country dominated environment that we're all habituated to. But I'd like to ask you guys about definitions. Something we've really struggled with is admitted to ICU. A lot of our contexts don't have ICUs, or a lot of our hospitals, even within the UK, I mean, the ICU was full. So we converted another ward into what we called an HDU or a sub-ICU, or, I mean, that definition got very murky even in settings where ICUs are standard places. So I'm sure you have other examples from your contexts. How do you manage that?
And one thing that can be done in that setting is think about treatments that you can actually accurately capture, either through billing codes or other things like use of vasopressors or intubation or, non-invasive ventilation or other things that normally would be done in an ICU across most settings. You could standardize different care environments where they don't even have an ICU, or it's full, or they're going to a secondary unit to do that. It is interesting. I helped with some efforts with the FDA early in the year of looking at patients with cancer who, had their cancer therapy stopped, because of COVID, and when they had a COVID infection, they recovered, they restarted their cancer therapies. Like, well, how can we tell they recovered from COVID? And there was no clear definition of COVID recovery. Like, you could have symptoms for a long time. We know you could be out of the hospital, but still be, symptomatic. And I said, well, what if you just looked at restarting their prior chemotherapy or cancer treatments that were there before they got COVID as a means for like a surrogate for saying they recovered? And that's a simple way to look at it. So I think the questions that you're asking is, go down to saying, what is the clinical care kind of pathway for a deterioration in patient status that would go to the ICU? And you can actually develop a way to figure that out just from data, more structured for the most part, that was a pretty good approximation of what being in an ICU would be.
I would agree with Matthew that we use the term the physical ICU and level of ICU care regardless of whether they were in physically ICU or not, because not only in the lower and middle income countries in our registry, but quite a few sites within the United States also had these makeshift ICUs, or floors were converted to cover the ICU patients. And then exactly that, did the patient receive level of ICU care regardless of being in ICU, were the questions. And then surrogacy of requirement of mechanical ventilation and some of the little bit more invasive treatment or management strategies were the surrogate for letting them know that these patients require that kind of care.
Thanks.
It's always wonderful to moderate a discussion where I don't have to do a whole lot of steering. This has been really, really engaging. As we start looking at our last 30 minutes together for this discussion, before we take a break for our second panel, I wanted to bring up, we've touched on this a little bit, and there's two interrelated factors here. There's the curation of data from disparate sources. And that can be either from looking at your billing data versus your clinical documentation. But then there's also this piece we've talked about looking at the way things are documented and data is available in different settings and in different countries. And there's the issue of curating the data itself, but there's also additional regulatory issues there. I'd love to open up to the whole panel to talk about how we're integrating these different data sources and dealing with the additional barriers that come with dealing with more than just one hospital or one health system's electronic health record. Go for it, Laura.
Okay, so this is what I've been doing for the last 22 months. We have 1,700 institutions who are contributing data to ISARC, and we are the data processors for all of those. With respect to a legal framework, I can comment very briefly because it's been the bane of my existence for the last months. we need to comply with every set of regulations and legislation that are out there. And I think that's absolutely important. And from GDPR to data protection agency now in the UK, we've had to deal with Brexit, even in the context of COVID. So our data protection regulations have changed, to the African Union Convention on Cybersecurity and Data Protection. So all of those need to be considered. You need to deal with the lawyers at those individual institutions. You need to make sure that you have documentation that's understandable by people and institutions who don't have a strong legal team ready to sign these types of things and review them. And you need to be flexible. And I will say, of the hundreds of, there's a document we have that we call the Terms of Submission, which is our data use agreement for ISARIC. And I think the #1 source of edits on our Terms of Submission have been from the US. And wanting to change the language and have particular, and that's fine, because we're happy to work in any context. And so we need to make sure we have the operational flexibility to adhere to the different requirements of the different international settings. And we need to respect the requirements of these different countries and work with them. So that's my comment on regulation and legal context. About data mapping, I'll put a quick plug for session 2, which is after this. If you would like to meet the woman responsible for pasting together the data, the very disparate data in many different languages, with many different clinical definitions and units and everything else, the woman who has mapped that all together for us will be here for your questions and entertainment and information in session 2. That's Kaylin Kennan, who works for EDO at Oxford. So we partnered with EDO because they have an amazing system to review and map and then wrangle all of these different data sets into, we use CDISC, SDTM. And I know that CDISC is a clinical trials data model, but we use it because the reason we're gathering these data is for research. Also because we gather clinical trial data that we layer on top of these data in a single registry so that you can access observational study data, clinical trial data, EHR data all together and ask questions across those different dimensions. So Kaylin brings all of this in and maps that all to CDISC SDTM, which is of course interoperable with the other data models that have been mentioned today. So please come to session 2 to learn more about that one. I'll hand over there.
Matthew, I saw you unmute.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, that is very impressive. I'm looking forward to seeing that, because that's a huge effort that you just described, Laura. But one of the things that's also interesting is different sources of real world data, whether that would be EHR data, claims data, other sources of data, even data that are generated by patients, this so-called person-generated health data. Trying to bring all those together is a big challenge, and again, probably requires multiple different partners, right? But we've been talking a lot about the clinician-generated data that are either generated in the EHR or from claims processing or from direct entry into a data platform for certain purposes. But there's a huge amount of data out there, that we could collect, or probably should, from patients when they're out of the clinical care setting, but is really valuable, like what's happening in their daily lives. Patient-reported outcomes, quality of life surveys, biosensors, and other things, because ultimately, as more care is done in a distributed manner in the home and telehealth and other things like that, we're blind to that right now for the most part. And so those are really unique things. But then you need permissioning and informed consent from the participants to do that. You can't just collect those data, de-identify them, and do research on that. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but it means that I think if we can start generating the will and the need to actually consent patients when they're getting their clinical care to say, are you willing to participate in research? Can we contact you for certain things? Do that, but then also feed that data back into the care, meaning like if I'm collecting a PRO from a patient for research, their physician probably should get that information as well. I mean, why do it just for one purpose? And I think that is how care will evolve. And, we have the technology to do it. We have the different platforms if we can marry them together. It's just a matter of trying to change how things are done going forward. And I'm a big proponent of figuring out ways to collect and bring together clinician-generated data and patient-generated data. And I think that's going to be the super value for the future for both care delivery and for research.
if you'd like a platform on which to test that out, we, in the context of our long COVID study, we've 17 of our 16 countries now participating in patient-facing surveys for long COVID to understand risk factors, symptoms, et cetera, and how long these last. And some of our sites are doing healthcare worker-driven surveys where either the patients come to clinic or they call them, and some of them have surveys where the patients complete them themselves. And understanding how to put those data together, which are the exact same questions that they're asking, but the ways that they're answered, you can tell, are quite different. And so we're just trying to learn how to match those up. Of course, the clinical staff have a lot of training. They understand the definitions, which patients might interpret differently. So
how do you, what's your response rate from patients with this type of survey? Does it wane over time?
I don't have a good answer for that. I think it's still quite new, and we really just got our 6-month data in. So can I come back to you in 6 months?
No, sure. That'd be great. Because one of the challenges with all these things is there's the, it tails off in the engagement. And that's why you really have to provide sustained value back to the participants, meaning you curate their data, give them benchmarks, give them, healthcare tips or something. And like, that's the part, like, to keep them engaged and contributing data for the long run. And I think everyone struggles with what model works best in that setting, but it's essential.
Yeah, no, the response bias is a real danger. I agree.
Yeah. Look forward to 6 months from now for another. Let's have another meeting.
Yeah.
This is certainly one of many conversations to have. Rahul and Paul, any comments from y'all?
It's a great conversation. I'm certainly excited as part of the virus registry that we're helping community health systems convert their data from their proprietary EMR into the OMOP common data model, because it'll be certainly facilitate the virus registry, but I'm hoping it also helps facilitate all the other registries that they can now participate in. And so and I'm hoping that we get away from this end-to-end integration problem with our proprietary EMR vendors. And so I feel like this registry is a great pioneer for how we should standardize on future registries. They can be collecting different data points, but it all can be coming from a similar data model that's flexible. So the OMOP data model supports over 150 different clinical vocabularies and over 9 million clinical concepts. And it's frankly a great place to start. It might not have the concept you're looking for, but it doesn't exist if it's not in there. It does cover clinical trials and observational research and EMR data, but it's also a great way, but you'll find that it is a great place to look for finding common knowledge that we can link into.
And I would just add to emphasize the sense of urgency, even though, we learned lessons from Ebola crisis and everything else, but I think we are still not prepared to handle the next pandemic. And sadly, it's going to hit within our lifetime, and if I'm not wrong, before 2030. So idea is that these unlikely partners are meeting today or over the last 18 months. We need to continue this collaboration. Those who are listening in as a participant, if you're one of those, we'll be happy to have you come join hands, CPATH, with EDO, with the ISRIC and virus registry or anything like that, especially in data automation, data definitions, consensus, and data standardization areas as well. So I think we are thankful for the vaccines. Otherwise, it'll be a even more painful pandemic. But I think we are far from being perfect to handle and collect the data in a rapid and standardized fashion. Those efforts are ongoing, and we need all help at this point to be ready for next 5-7 years.
Rahul, I'll just mention, actually, just jumping in now, is that it is a toolbox, right? Where we need to develop. It's not one tool. We don't have a magic bullet, but it's a completion of a toolbox that allows us to use right tools in different areas and different combinations to be able to achieve the maximal effort. I also like the fact that we're starting to discuss big data. And by big data, I mean it's not just one data source. EHRs is definitely something that we're interested in and exploring. But I do like the way that others are thinking about using biosensors, including telehealth, electronic patient-reported outcomes. All of those have their own sort of little idiosyncrasies to be able to incorporate what we're learning into it. It involves informed consents, IRBs, a lot of other sort of regulatory issues to make sure that we're not that patient privacy is also being considered on this. So there's some challenges, but I think that it's, you know, the question I think, Matt, you raised is that oftentimes the engagement does fall, and that is a very true issue. And so that means, just like everything else, there's what's the key pieces of information that we need, so that we're not overburdening the individuals that say, oh, I've got to do my daily diary and it's going to take me half an hour to do it because it's just whatever. So it's gonna, you know, it's this right amount of questions to answer the right question to get the data that we want, but not overburden the group. And the other thing that I was thinking is that you know, we've been having some discussions, at least in our consortia, with rare disease groups, and they tend to be really, especially the rare diseases that are in pediatrics and neonates. The parents are really very passionate about all of that, and so they will, you know, go over the top to be able to ensure that they could provide any information that can help, you know, their child, their loved ones, and then, you know, you also have that community that you can do that with. I'm just thinking about ways in which we could be able to pilot certain programs within a smaller community that are engaged, to be able for us to learn a little bit more about it and then sort of branch out to something that's an infectious disease and a pandemic when we're talking about millions and millions of people. If we maybe want to start off with a smaller group so that we can learn from it, that may be an opportunity that CDRC can help. It's also, we have, you know, within CPATH, we do have consortia around patient-reported outcomes, and that may be another potential alternative or way in which we can help contribute to this issue as well.
Along those same lines, again, a session 2 plug. Also attending session 2 is Will Stevens, who's the data manager for the Recovery trial. Others might know Recovery is the world's largest COVID interventional trial and has produced much of the great evidence that's out. And happy to say it's UK driven and my boss runs it. So there's my disclaimer. But Will is mapping together 9 different sources of death data into that clinical trial and creating algorithms for deciding which of those, which are definitively disparate and have different, you know, results on them, can be trusted, and in which cases you use different types of data. So that's from the National Death Registry to the CRF filled out by the nurse, and how you compare and decide between those. So I'm sure he'll offer some good examples.
Yeah, that's a great example there of, and this is also within the other countries that are participating now outside the UK as well. Is that true?
Less so, because there are fewer sources of data. The UK is incredibly well connected, and you'll hear about it soon, from all the GP records to, we have the privilege of a national health service. So all of the data from all of the hospitals go to one place. And those get mapped together with national genomic responses, et cetera. So it's a privileged environment that we're in. And I don't think there is a country internationally that can match that level of data linking, data availability, data ubiquity, data access. So you can hear more about those coming up. But there are other sources in other countries, certainly. And it's the public health agencies and having the epidemiological data that's been helpful in certain cases. Definitely patient questionnaires have been used. And I don't know other examples, but I bet Will have examples for you for the international cohorts.
I mean, the challenge with any national death registry is the latency, right? Because sometimes it's like 6-9 months. In the United States, it's 18 months. Maybe it's a little shorter now, but it's just not fit for purpose for prospective studies. And I had the privilege of leading a fully EHR-based study, a trial that was just concluded earlier this year in the US. We found that direct participant contact was really the only way to confirm vital status, unless you captured a death in hospital through the EHR surveillance. But many deaths don't occur in hospital. Now, for acute COVID, that's maybe different, right? You know, for the in-hospital mortality versus post-discharge. But I think it's a big vital status, you know, after a hospitalization or in chronic care settings is really difficult. Look at visit frequency in the clinic. If they miss a visit, that doesn't mean that they've died. It might mean they go to a different clinic or something else is going on. So that would be really interesting to see how that was done, particularly for a trial that needs it to be pretty timely, right? To be, you know, to get that information and not wait for months and months to have that.
I agree. And my only reflection on that is that it's very contextualized. So it depends where you are. Every environment is different. Every health system is different. I worked for 7 years in Vietnam, and one of the outcomes that was highly used, we ran very high mortality trials on our case report form, was discharged to die. Because you don't want to die in hospital, because then your body gets kept for a certain number of days. It's very inconvenient. It's very costly. Then it's not what the family want. And so people would not die in hospital. They would be purposefully discharged so that they wouldn't. And so how do you treat that? Do you treat that as a death? And on what day do you attribute that death? And you don't necessarily get it followed up. So, that's one case.
Yeah.
So as we reach near the end of our time for this panel, we do want to make sure we have time for a brief intermission before we move to panel 2. Please stick around. It's going to be a very engaging conversation. We're going to cover many of the same concepts, but as Laura pointed out, from the perspective of a system where there's much more data sources available at a federal level to bring together. I wanted to invite our panelists to give their closing thoughts on the interpandemic period. We are reaching a point where COVID is shifting from a pandemic to an endemic. And a lot of the work that we have done has largely relied on the motivation of a crisis to be able to get this work done. A lot of our work has been done with minimal or no funding. How do we make sure, as Rahul pointed out, the next pandemic is coming, the next crisis is coming, it'll come in our lifetimes, it'll come in our careers. How do we make sure that we have continued engagement, that we continue to maintain these infrastructures, that we are ready to respond to the next pandemic so we don't end up with another H1n1 like failure? I know that's a deep, heavy question to answer in 20 minutes for anybody, but anyone wants to take a swing at it, or your in general closing thoughts?
This is Paul. I could take a first. I'll try to do a bunt on it. And that is, you're right, the pandemic really changed the way, especially in the US, on how health systems share data. So we saw a much greater willingness for health systems to share row level patient data for the National COVID Consortium that really helped us address how we can treat and study how we treat this disease in an EMR. So I do feel that was a wonderful setting, and I hope that doesn't go away. However, one thing you even heard in my language today, I'm trying to shift the value of why we're doing this to health systems, saying we want you to support registries by reducing costs, so improving efficiency. I am concerned we spent a lot of money on healthcare over the past couple of years, and there's going to be a lot of pressure for reducing costs in healthcare. And I do feel like what we need to do is we need to reduce non-value waste in healthcare. And a lot of that non-value waste is in coding or in areas where we're having people manually type in fields from one screen into another. And so that's where I'm looking for, how do we help improve the efficiencies of data collection for registries so we don't get starved out of the growth and data that we're looking to help us make these new discoveries.
I'll add, or go ahead if you were going
to. Okay, so briefly, I think a few of the things that we can do is we've all found a lot of interim solutions over the last months. I think we need to work hard to solidify those. We can do a better job of understanding the legal contexts of the various countries that we're working in and make sure that we have really robust solutions that can be spread not just within the research centers we're working with, but wider throughout those countries. Next, I think we need to engage all of our different sites in building ways to do things better. And part of that is going to be integrating the research response into the public health response, working with public health agencies to understand what information they need, how we can resource and strengthen capacity insights to make sure that they're feeding into that public health response system. We're looking at linking epidemiological data and genomic data to the clinical data, so supporting different public health agencies to be able to do that in their own contexts. And so that's what we're going to focus on in the coming times. And stay in touch with sites, understand what they need, and do things in the interim. There's lots of outbreaks happening all the time around the world. So we don't just build systems for the next big severe acute respiratory illness. There's viral hemorrhagic fevers and other syndromes that also require attention.
Yeah, I'll add to that I think one of the stakeholder groups that we really haven't discussed here are those who develop medical products, pharmaceutical, biotechnology, device companies, right? They should be part of the solution going forward. And there are ways through public-private partnerships like CDRC to engage them, to get funding from them in a non-competitive way to actually support this infrastructure development, support all the legal framework that Laura nicely described, so it's reusable and repeatable, and have data partnerships that really matter, and advance research goals, but also advance clinical care delivery goals and make that be more efficient. I think and the payer community also is one that has to be part of the solution in the equation. And to date, there hasn't really been much involvement with payers other than contributing claims to certain efforts and so forth. But there's a way to develop this, maybe taking advantage of a model like Sentinel, with the FDA, where, payers have actually participated in a worthwhile public health endeavor, by contributing their claims data. Let's take that few steps further, have things to address this pandemic, but have them available and continue to be used for other purposes. And I think there's definitely a way to do that. The last group is the EHR vendors that I mentioned earlier. They're challenging, but they should be part of the solution as well. And I think there's definitely ways. And I think that by convening these groups, having ongoing research goals and objectives that also contribute to improved care delivery is the way to do it. And different models of the past won't work. We really need new models for the future. And the ones that Laura has described, Paul, Rahul, and others are really interesting and unique. And we need to build on that and just fundamentally not do things the way we did in the past, but do them better in the future.
Last, I would like to go at this, probably at the risk of sounding as a broken record. I'll give you these 3 points, those who are joining as a panelist, as a participant, our next panel. My 3 take-home messages. Number 1 is, I think the emphasis is already, but not enough, on data harmonization and data automation. I think we need to do a better job. We have to put all our resources and heads together now in next couple of years to find that sweet one solution which should replace the last 17 solutions which did not work. It should not become the 18th solution. My second point is, as Mother Teresa has said, no money, no mission. Funding is going to be a key. So those who are here today, I would like us to emphasize and have opportunities to apply, seek, or line up some of these funding opportunities. And if you're one of the funders listening today, talk to us. Talk to Marco, talk to Dr. Havner, any of us, Dr. Sheeter, Dr. Havner, any of us in that regard. And third is, which is I would really want to emphasize as the take-home message for all of us, is these collaborations. This did not happen. It reminds me, I can't say my time, I'm not that old, when the last major update happened during the healthcare time was in Second World War from 1939 to 1945. The field moved so quickly during that time. Same thing I have seen it is happening in last couple of years. So I think preserving these collaborations, expanding these collaborations, bringing other stakeholders. Patients with the one stakeholder is totally missing in these discussions. The data scientists, the machine learning people, and some of those things, bringing them into these fold. And ultimately, this observational data, real world data, is good for hypothesis generation, maybe finding something which we don't, but transitioning and leveraging this data to use into like EMR based platform trials, which some of us are involved. I would like us to take that challenge to see how we can utilize the knowledge learned from these things to actually towards either repurpose or new medications as a EMR based platform trials. So 3 points: data harmonization, automation, we have to do better job. Funding, no money, no mission, and preserving and expanding our collaboration and taking it to the next level.
Thank you all. Dr. Taken, do you have any closing thoughts?
So rather than we have very nice comments in the chat box. So I would like to make sure that everyone sees those. So crowdsourcing, definitely. Government action globally, definitely. And uniform approach, like absolutely. And all of the things that our panelists mentioned already.
Thank you so much. I want to again thank all of our esteemed panelists for joining today. This has been a really engaging conversation to the point that the notes that I took were awful. I only had a couple scribbles, so I'm looking forward to reviewing this recording when it's available so that I can make some better notes about how we're going to better collaborate in the future. We will move into a brief 10-minute intermission. We'll move our panelists into a private session so that we can double check any technical details, any technical issues before we move into that second panel discussion, which will be moderated by Dr. Merson. And then co-moderated, I'll be there as a co-moderator. We'll be discussing many of the similar concepts, revisiting some of the concepts that we have here, but from a very different context. Laura, is there anything else you want to say about your panel coming up in 10 minutes?
No, just to say it offers a really different perspective. So please welcome, come. I hope all the panelists here will be there just to see how things work a little bit differently in other places. But yeah, I hope to see you all soon.
Sorry, Laura, I'm Smith. We have connect now. We are. I am Miguel Pereira from Hospital of Octubre. Can you hear us correctly?
Yes, Miguel, you're in perfect timing to give just the intro. So Miguel and colleagues are one of the panelists in the next session. So we look forward to seeing you all there.
Okay, thank you.
So you will see your panel disappear for just about 10 minutes. Please take this time to take a bio break, refill your coffee cup, and we'll be back with you in just a minute.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. We hope that you took the opportunity on your break to stand up and walk around. Again, we're glad that you're here with us. To get started on our second panel session, I'm going to move us over to Laura Merson.
Thank you, Pamela. And thanks everybody for being here for this last session of this meeting. I hope you really enjoyed the whole session and the whole meeting as much as we have. So today we're going to present a wonderful panel of experts who are engaged in lots of different uses of real-world data. If you were here for session 1, you'll have heard us drop in some suggestions of what they are working on. It's everything from harvesting GP records to mapping EHR data for the purpose of outbreak research to pasting together many different sources of information for clinical trials. So thank you. My name is Laura Merson. I work at the University of Oxford within groups called EDO and ISARIC. And if you were here earlier, you heard a little bit about what I do. So I'll hand over to my co-host, Smith, to present himself in case anyone missed you previously.
Thank you, Laura. I am Smitty Hevner. I am the scientific director for the Cure Drug Repurposing Collaboratory, the host for this meeting. My background is in critical care and emergency nursing. And I've been involved with the virus registry through the course of the pandemic, as well as local data automation efforts at a number of different hospitals throughout the United States.
Now, with apologies, we've missed one of our panelists off of this initial screen that you see in front of you. So Alex Walker is also here from the Open Safely Initiative, and you'll hear from him in just a few minutes. So the way that we'll run the panel is that we'll ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves. As you see by the asterisks, a couple of them have recorded talks in advance, so you can find those talks on the website and on YouTube. But I want to make sure that you know the breadth of expertise that we have within our panel today. And so beginning with Will Stevens, I'm going to invite a brief introduction from each of them to talk about what they're doing. So Will, can I hand over to you?
I'm Will Stevens from the University of Oxford in the Nuffield Department of Population Health. My background is in computer science and maths, and I work on the recovery trial of treatments for COVID-19, which started just at the beginning of the epidemic in the UK last March. My role in the trial is to use data from electronic healthcare systems for putting together the outcomes for the trial and to map these data to a standard format using CDISC, SDTM and ADAM standards so that the data can then be used for regulatory review and then shared with other researchers too. We use electronic healthcare data mainly for mortality outcomes, use of ventilation and use of renal replacement therapy. And we've got currently about 17 different sources for those data. And there's quite a lot of overlap between the data provided from different sources. We request the data every few weeks, and that becomes more frequent when the recruitment rate is high, and less frequent when it's lower. Every data set that we receive is curated, and a data engineer has the job of extracting the relevant variables from those data sets and doing basic standardization, for example, of dates before passing on the data to me, which I then use it to create the outcome variables for the trial and map it to SDTM and ADAM. So SDTM is the effectively representation of the data that we get in a standard format, and the ADAM datasets are used for analysis. We do a data cut every few weeks for the data monitoring committee, and we retain every data cut that we do for future reference, and every so often one of the data cuts will be used as a basis for publications. Recovery is a platform trial, so treatments can be added and removed as the trial progresses. So one of the important things related to that is version control. That's probably been the biggest challenge of the trial, keeping track of the frequent changes to protocol and CRFs. That's it from me.
That's great. Huge thanks, Will. Many people might know the recovery trial, which has been one of the most impactful trials that is being run internationally on COVID. And I think Will might agree that it's one of the most pragmatic trials and also one of the most complex. So we welcome questions in the chat from any of you that you'd like to ask Will. Next, I'll hand over to Kaylin.
Thank you for that, Laura. Welcome, everybody. As Laura mentioned, my name is Kaylin Kennan. I'm the head of data engineering at the Infectious Diseases Data Observatory, which is based in Oxford in the UK. And what we are, we're a global coalition of the emerging infections and infectious diseases communities. And we promote and support the data sharing and reuse of data to generate new evidence in order to improve patient outcomes. And so the way that we do that is we work with data generators all around the world, and they contribute their data to EDO, and that information is then reformatted, standardized, and pooled to, similar to Will, to the CDISC SDTM standard. And that way the data can be pooled together to generate more evidence, using larger populations. And that data is available for request via our data access committee. So that information is, and in relation to this meeting, we also aggregate data for COVID-19. And that's in partnership with the group that Laura mentioned, ESARIC, who actually collect that data. And they have a variety of partners who collect it in different ways, in different formats, different variables. And so that process of taking all of that data that can be in many different standards, that human heavy labor-intensive process of actually reformatting and standardizing that data so it can be pooled together. That's what we do at EDO. And so that kind of real world data where it's being collected during a pandemic, it's being collected ongoing, and the type of data being collected is changing, is quite dynamic. And so it's also quite challenging. And we've learned a lot doing that and going through our experience with that. So hopefully can share a lot of that here with the panel. And yeah, that's what we do. Thanks.
Thanks, Kaylin. So if anyone has ever thought that you cannot combine apples and oranges, Kaylin will prove you wrong. With that, I will hand over to Alex for an introduction.
Thank you. So I'm Alex Walker. I'm an epidemiologist at the Data Lab in Oxford. And the Data Lab is a group of academics, clinicians, and software engineers. And our broad aims are to make medical research more open, more reproducible, and more robust. And I'm here today to talk about our Open Safely project, which was created to answer urgent COVID-19 related questions in March 2020. We have 58 million patients worth of data, which is about 96% of the English population, and our data contains primary care data, and that's linked to hospital inpatient and outpatient data, emergency care data, COVID testing data, and a few other data sets. For example, Ethnicity is one that we've recently been importing into the platform. So our team is responsible for building the platform, and we also do research in it. And more recently, we've been facilitating other external groups to use the data. So just for a bit of perspective, the sort of standard old way of doing electronic health care research. So when I did my PhD sort of 10, 15 years ago, you'd apply to an organization to get data, and then they would literally just send it to you on a disk, and you would promise to take good care of it. But obviously that approach, with the sort of increasing awareness of and needs for data security and confidentiality, that approach is no longer valid. So the sort of trusted research environment approach is now preferred. The big difference with Open Safely, and one of the things that allowed us to get going so quickly at the start of the pandemic, was that the data remains in the place where it was generated. So we work with primary care health electronic health record providers, and the data is held within that primary care health software provider. And then the other thing is that researchers never actually see the underlying data. The code that is written, this sort of analytic code that is written, is sent to the data, and then you get back the sort of summary results from that. So it's even more secure, and that researchers never actually see the data itself. So in terms of actually getting the data, we've come up with the concept of a study definition, which defines the population of patients that you want to use and all of the necessary variables. So for example, you might have a code list for diabetes, and you would pass that code list to one of our functions and give it some dates. So say you want to look for people diagnosed with diabetes within a particular time frame, and then you'd also tell it what kind of variable you want to get out of it, so like a binary indicated variable or a date or something else. And then from that study definition, that then produces a file which can then be analyzed with Python or R or Stata or whatever you want. And then the other thing about Open Safely is that in order to run code on Open Safely, it all must be on GitHub, which is a code repository for anybody who's not familiar with it. Oh, and sorry, one more thing is that because the data are held within the individual primary care providers, at the moment we work with two of those providers, one called TPP and one called EMIS, but the data within those will never be able to aggregate together into one place. So we have to do federated analytics, where we send the same code, the same analytic code, to the two places, and then pull out summary results from that and combine them in the open. Yeah, so that's all I have to say.
That's great. Thanks, Alex. I imagine others are quite busy thinking about the possibilities of having access to the GP record, or the primary healthcare records, of 96% of the population. But actually, I think most people are busy thinking about the fact that you admitted that you were old enough to be getting research on CDs so long ago. With that, as we wait for Anne-Marie, I will hand over to Miguel and colleagues to introduce themselves.
Thank you, Laura, for the presentation. Hello, everyone. I am Miguel Pedrera from the University of Octubre. I am the responsible of the data area of the hospital. And with me are Noelia Garcia, our technical responsible of data analysis, and Pablo Serrano, our chief planning director. And of course, say thank you also for the attendees for interest in this session and in this experience. So Philosophy Octubre has a long history of innovation in the data area, and it has been demonstrated in different national and international relevant projects. And all this knowledge and methodologies, tools, processes developed in these past years was put into action during the COVID-19 pandemic in order to solve the need to obtain data for healthcare and also for secondary uses in an efficient, flexible, and agile way. So we designed and implement a methodology for this process of obtaining data with no manual data entry, a specific research system. So this methodology was published in the Journal of Biomedical Informatics, and it has it's been a high impact. So it has been cited recent for paper of the CDC of the USA. And in this paper, we show this methodology and also the results obtained for the first implementation of this methodology that was for obtaining and loading the EHR data to the ISARIC REDCap database of this consortium. So we achieved more than 85% of the coverage of this first implementation of the methodology. And we implement the methodology directly into the real healthcare information system of the hospital because we govern the EHR of the organization. So that means that we manage the conceptual and data model of the different information system of the hospital, and we can implement advanced and standardized data entry mechanisms in these systems. So first, we design and implement the information models, in our case, according to the ISO 13606 standard, and also using clinical terminology such as SNOMED-CT and LOINC. And then this standard EHR extract was transformed into a specific data model. For example, as I said before, the ISARIC CRF model. So for that, we use the Ehr programming language to implement these ETL extraction, transformation, and loading processes. And we also use Ehr language to apply data quality analysis on the obtained automatic data from the EHR to measure the completeness and the correctness of the data. So we don't have applied this methodology just in the for the ISARIC CRF consortium model. So we apply the methodology for other COVID-19 projects. For example, we are using this process of obtaining data directly from the EHR in the 4CA consortium of the Harvard University, also in the EDIN consortium, and in the Trinetic platform, where we are the reference, the European reference in the modeling and loading COVID-19 data. So now that's all of my presentation. So now we respond the question of the audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miguel, and all of you for being here. The work that you've done has been incredible and has covered so much of your hospital. Session 1 of this discussion was talking about the burden of filling out case report forms for frontline healthcare workers. And you have managed to circumvent that and find solutions for that, which is wonderful. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
The first thing I'd like to ask all of you, and so please feel free to speak up and volunteer to be first, but is how did the pandemic and the emergence of COVID-19 change the way that you were working? So all of you were involved in your individual fields before the pandemic emerged. What's different? What did you do differently? What did you innovate? What did you change? And Miguel, just because you're on the screen, would you and your colleagues like to start?
Okay, thank you, Laura. We think in the pandemic, the first change was the urgency, and we have worked with agile methodologies to implementation in a short time, and for using first in healthcare, and secondary for use of data in different purposes. The other methodologies is the same for the other clinical conditions that we work, but the difference is the urgency of the pandemic.
Yes, as Pablo said, and I say before in the presentation, we are researching in the data area years and years ago. So in the COVID-19 pandemic, we put into action all this knowledge previously defined, acquired. So the COVID-19, I think that has demonstrated that this that the EHR is useful for healthcare and also for secondary uses, and that this methodology based on clinical standards are very important to make more efficient and more agile the research in this COVID-19 disease, but also in others.
Thanks, Miguel. Alex, Kaylin, Will, do any of you want to tackle that?
Sure. So previous to the pandemic, we were at EDO, we're used to kind of receiving complete data. So data from a trial that had finished or another, end of mass drug administration or something like that. But obviously when COVID came along, it was ongoing collection and they needed that data right away. We couldn't wait until COVID was over to then, curate everything. So we had to adjust to an iterative curation process. I don't know if you guys were at the panel before, but they were mentioning, we didn't know what we didn't know at the beginning of the pandemic, and new variables came up, new diagnostics, new treatments, things like that. So the type of data that we were collecting and curating changed. And so we had to be very flexible and very, agile and adjusting and catching up and adding and updating. And so it's been a bit of an experience with that, with the constant kind of chasing the data and updating it. And yeah, that's the biggest change for us.
Alex, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. So I think that the biggest change with us was speed, and there's sort of two aspects to that. First is the speed with which we got approval to use the data. So in the UK, the Secretary of State for Health issued what's called a COPI notice, which is control of patient information, which mandated companies or organizations that hold medical data to share that data for the purpose of using it to help with the pandemic. So that really sped up the sort of approval of being able to use the data, and we obviously hope to extend that ability to use the data beyond the pandemic. But then also the sort of speed with which the organizations within the Open Safe League Collaborative were suddenly able to work together, because basically everybody dropped everything and we started working together very quickly. So that's our group in the data lab in Oxford, and then there's the electronic health records group in the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and then also the data providers, TPP and EMIS, were sort of incredibly helpful with that.
Alex, I'm going to emphasize that for those on the call who don't speak British. So what a COPI notice does, it's an intervention by the UK government who can decide that healthcare data can be used without consent for research and public health purposes. And to me, I think that's a novel intervention, but I'll leave it to the Q&A chat if anyone wants to ask any questions about that. Will, did you want to add anything about how your life changed 2 years ago?
I think for us, one of the big changes was working a lot with other groups who had the expertise that we needed. I think it was the job of the investigators to find out where the expertise was that the trial needed. So we work with a couple of different trial units are involved with organising and running the trial and setting up the IT systems, and then a group from computer science were already familiar with some of the data sources because they are responsible for the data dictionary system for some of the sources. So they were on board and were involved in extracting and preparing the data. Another big difference was the rapid turnaround time that needed for this, whereas for our previous trials, we'd often have weeks to prepare for for a data monitoring committee meeting, say, and getting all the data up together for that. The turnaround time here was a lot quicker. So at the height of the pandemic, we were having one data monitoring committee meeting per week, and we'd get the data on a Tuesday or Wednesday, and the meeting was on a Thursday, so we had to be prepared to do it really quickly and make sure it was correct, because the data might also be used for publication straight afterwards.
One comment I've heard about the use of real-world data is the lack of trust that people have in it. You know, if you haven't got a trained healthcare professional with a sheet that says, is this true, yes or no, and that they check off one or the other, that it's an ad hoc data collection, and that there's less confidence in it to some of the reflections that are being had. So I'd like to hear all of your perspectives on the trustworthiness of data that you receive. I know that Will, with all of your multiple sources of different data, which may or may not align, you know, how you take decisions between those, or Alex, maybe the limitations of what GPs do and do not record, or Miguel, maybe some of the things that are or are not available within EHR records. And Kaylin, I'm sure you have a breadth of data quality issues that get submitted. So should we stay with you, Will? Could you make a comment on that?
Good example of this is the mortality data that we have from quite a few different sources. So for each nation, we have a different source, and then we have as well. And we sometimes get provisional death data from some sources that's later verified and turned into a more reliable source. So one thing we could do, because we had lots of different sources, was to compare them and work out how likely each one was to be wrong. And we also had the gold standard civil registration death data as well, which is more or less the definition of date of death for a person. So we could compare against it, and that enabled us to rank the sources in terms of how reliable they were. So when we did a data freeze, the people who died, say, a month or more ago, we'd have a more reliable date for that. But for those in the intervening period, which we still wanted to know about the deaths then, because we had to make quick decisions about whether a treatment was working or not, we'd use the less reliable sources for those, but ranked in order of how reliable we'd worked out they were. And that would be used for data monitoring committee reports and a preliminary, possibly, and then later on, a final use the more reliable.
Okay, we'll end Will's answer there, and maybe I'll hand over. I mean, Alex, do you want to tackle that next, and issues of trust and data quality?
Sure. So yeah, to some extent, with the different data sets that you use, it's reliant on a bit of folk knowledge on what can be relied upon and what can't. So, for example, the primary care prescribing data is known to be pretty reliable because it's essentially impossible to generate a prescription without it going into an electronic record. Whereas something like measuring somebody's symptoms when they go to the doctor and the doctor, it might be very common for a doctor to write down what they're observing, but in terms of formally coding that into a way that's easy to turn into a variable is much more difficult. So it's, yeah, there's a lot of awareness needed on the different foibles of the different data sets, I suppose.
Miguel, Noelia, can you comment on data quality in EHRs, either in the mapping process or in what's in those EHRs?
Yes, the data quality, as you say, is fundamental to track in the EHR for secondary uses, for example, research. So we think that it's important to separate two levels of data quality. First, the data quality of the EHR, and then the data quality of the data models obtained directly from EHR but transformed to a specific data model. So in the analysis of the EHR and the governance of the EHR, it's fundamental to define previously the conceptual model that you are going to implement in the EHR using, for example, archetypes that define the structure of the model, also the semantic and the constraints of this model. For example, the maximum and minimum value, the value sets, the unit of measure, etc. So if you implement in your EHR data forms based on these previously designed archetypes, you can to control how data is recorded in the information system. So in fundamental, the data in EHR apply good practice of data quality. So then also the second part of the analysis is to, as I said before, to measure the data quality of the specific data for example, the CDRC or other specific project. And that is that Noelia are going to present our expert in data quality.
Yeah, well, when we use the EHR data for secondary uses, we found some limitation. For example, we just have available the data that is recorded in the clinical practice, and this is something opposite as the methodology that is applied in the clinical trials. When first of all the model is defined, the data model is defined, and then they capture the data. Here is the opposite. We have the data available, and then you can use it. And another limitation of the EHR system is that the data is less structured, and that's why we need the data quality analysis that Miguel has mentioned.
Yeah, we spoke about that in the first session, about when doctors who see patients at hospitals, they collect some information, but not necessarily all of the information, and the challenge with not having those denominators, but maybe we'll come back to that. Kaylin, I know that this is not your first outbreak. What have you got to say about emerging infections data and quality issues?
I think from my experience that it's always going to be a trade-off. It's either you wait a really long time for really great clinical trials where you can have perfect, beautiful data collected and just be in the dark until then, or you make determinations of perhaps this data is not of the exact quality it would be in a clinical trial, but it is still of use. And so learning how to make that data of use and understand what of it is useful, and just knowing that it's not exactly like, it's not the gold standard of a clinical trial, but they're expensive. They take a long time. And so I think it's important to not just write off the value of this type of data because it's not clinical trial data.
So Will, maybe we'll come back to you. I know that some of your colleagues believe in big numbers as the solution to some of those data quality issues. If you can hear me well, can you comment on that and anything else that you wanted to add about? We just missed the end of your discussion on quality.
Yeah, I think big and unbiased numbers are important, I guess. I think that if there are errors in the data, they might not necessarily make any difference to the results. One thing we looked at for a recent treatment comparison was what happens if we just use the data from the CRF, which is completed in hospital, and so that it misses about 6% of the death data if the participant dies after discharge from hospital, and compared that to just using all of the electronic healthcare data, not including the CRF, and the outcomes and the confidence intervals, that is the rate intervals, were almost exactly the same. Some of them differed in the second decimal place, so by 1% or less, and that gives us some confidence that even if there is missing data from some of the sources, if it's not biased, you're still can be quite confident of getting reliable results.
So we're really looking forward to the research that I hope your group is going to do in comparing what the results would have been if you had only used source A versus B versus C. I hope you have that planned coming forward. Will, there was a question that was put to me in the first session, which I did not know the answer to, which was about the recovery trial and whether recovery was sourcing multiple sources of data within other countries internationally. Do you have the answer to that?
At the moment, we're not. We're just using CRF, electronic CRF data from the international sites. I believe there is there has been discussion about registries in other countries. I can't say off the top of my head how far that is progressing.
Okay. And while we're on the topic of other countries, I'm interested in how the technologies that each of you work on might be applicable in other countries, in other settings. So what that you're doing do you think could support other people? And Miguel, if it's okay, because I have read your paper, and I think that was a great way to share your results, can you comment on what you can share with the rest of the world and what they can learn from your experience?
Okay. When you want to combine data from different sources in the same country or different countries and organizations, it's fundamental to base your process, data entry, and extraction and transformation and loading of data in different databases have to be based on standards. It's fundamental to base all this process in common framework. For example, for the modeling of the information models, in our case, I said before, using archetypes, or maybe you can use OpenAIR or ISO 15606 or other kind of standard. Also, you need to apply a standard in the interoperability process, in the exchange of data from point A to point B, for example, using HL7 or FIRE, etc. And also it's fundamental that the ETL process that you have to implement for transforming data into different data models. For example, in our case, in our paper, into the static CDRC model, but for other purposes also. This ETL process, if you define based on EHR, standardized EHR and output data model validated, for example, in static, you can share this mechanism to other organizations and apply on the information system. So it's fundamental that the EHR, the ETL process, and the output model is based on different kind of standards. In our case, for example, the first implementation of the methodology was the static model because it was a validated and relevant model in the COVID-19 research. So we prefer to use this kind of standard model than a local model of our hospital that is not scalable to other organizations. So in conclusion, the standard have to be used if you want to extend this process to other sites.
It's great, Miguel. And of course, having that in the academic literature is a good way to share that with everyone else. Does anyone else have comments on how you can share your experience, other than participating in this webinar, of course, but how else can you get the message across to others?
Laura, we do have an interesting question in the chat before we shift too far away from this discussion of data quality. It says, was asking whether there's been any sensitivity analyses on data sets to determine how much missingness or data quality issues we can tolerate when using real world data.
So my guess is that Alex on the analytic end might have something to say about that. Would that be fair, Alex?
Yeah, so in terms of sort of missingness, it's very variable depending on what you're measuring. So if you're measuring just something simple like age, basically everybody has a date of birth recorded in the database, but something like ethnicity, which you might want to measure for some studies, in the primary care record, there's only about 70% of people have a recorded ethnicity in the record. Now you can supplement that with other linked data sets. So if you take the ethnicity from hospitals, you get up to 90-something%. But then that's also problematic because then the people who still don't have a recorded ethnicity haven't been to primary care recently and haven't been to hospital, so they're a slightly unusual group. But in terms of the analyses we've done so far, so to take ethnicity as an example again, we've done lots of sort of multiple imputation to try and fill in missing data there, and that's broadly not made a lot of difference in terms of the conclusions of the studies that we've been running. So, you know, while 30% being missing isn't great, it doesn't necessarily have catastrophic consequences for the study you're doing.
Alex, 30% is that same threshold that I've seen used across many of the historic analyses. And that sounds like a lot of missing data. And I think Will would probably tell us in a clinical trial that was unacceptable. What I've seen, what's important is, of course, why it's missing. And are there patterns to that missingness? And so that's what we need to be able to dig into a little bit more, and especially in the context of real world data. Will, have you been involved in any discussions about missing data and data quality and sensitivity analysis for those?
There is a paper, I've forgotten the reference, but there's a paper comparing missingness versus bias and showing that you can tolerate a lot of missing data without affecting the results, but you can't tolerate very much bias in the data. So a small amount of bias can be bad, but a large amount of missingness might not be so bad.
And how, in your words, would you tell the difference?
Good question. And knowing why it's missing is really important. So if it's missing and it's missing for a reason which causes bias between the treatment arms, then you need to try and assess whether that's the reason why it's missing.
Miguel, have you dealt with missingness in the EHR records and seen either missing data or patients with missing data? And how have you managed that?
Yes, in our case, we have analyzed the completeness of the data obtained from the EHR, in this case, according to the ISARIC data model. And in our case, completeness was good. We, for example, in the observation domain of the ISARIC model, we achieved more than, in the majority of concepts, more than 85% of the cohort covered with this data. But as you say, a specific variable has a poor record in the EHR. For example, an example of this kind of concept is the date of onset of the symptoms of the disease that is collected in free text in the EHR. So now we are not using for this purpose NLP, natural language processing methods. So this data that is now in free text, we cannot use in this ETL process to obtain a secondary use model. Our approach now is to improve the EHR with standardized models and structured models. So when a professional want to obtain a data tool from the EHR and he see that some data is not included in the REDCap or in the clinical dashboard or the repository, etc., he see that the problem is not our ETL process or the transformation, but that in the source this data is missing. So he's improved the record in the EHR, and in next steps of the application of this methodology, this data will be in the secondary use tool.
And have you made any efforts to go back to the doctors and talk to them about how they complete those EHRs? And is that reflected in your research?
Yes, it's the process that we are applying in the hospital when we work with a clinical service in a specific clinical condition to obtain data. And for example, for research, we analyze what model we want to implement, ISARIC, H1n1, etc. And then we analyze the data source. We do a study of the availability of variables in the EHR and how it are collected now in the EHR, and we first talk with the responsible of the project to say that some variables are not being collected in the EHR. But I think that when the healthcare professionals see that he have to improve the EHR data entry process is when he see the secondary use tool, for example, a RedCap database or a repository, and he see the missing data. So he understand that if he doesn't do a good data entry in the EHR, the secondary use product that we can obtain are poor. So he is the way to improve the EHR with the help of the healthcare professional.
I think that sounds like a great feedback loop. Alex, are you sending reports to the GPs telling them that some of them are not doing good enough data entry? Or evaluating that?
That's not something we've done before. We have talked with, because we work closely with the electronic health record providers, we've talked about giving feedback to GPs, but more in a sort of clinical perspective rather than you haven't entered this bit of data correctly way. But yeah, that's certainly something that could be explored.
Kaylin, can you say a few words about what your group is doing with respect to standardizing the case report forms for different diseases and determining what data gets collected?
So a lot of the kind of downstream issues of having to try and aggregate disparate data can be addressed by collecting that data the same way to begin with, which, you know, if you could wave a magic wand and do that, that would make life much easier. But that's not the way it works. People use their own systems and collect things the way that they want. And so we've been putting effort into creating standardized CRFs so that people can use them and you know, customize them for whatever trial or whatever data collection event that they're using. So that way variable names are similar, the type of data collected is similar. And really importantly, one thing that we often found issues with was the metadata about that data. So for example, if you just have temperature and there's, well, that's a bad example because you can tell temperature for unit lab tests and they don't record the units, you know, that's of limited use. So just ensuring that that type of data is collected, especially around timing. A lot of times we get data where there's multiple lab results for a single day, but there's no timing about it. So they all look like duplicates and you don't know when they happened. So just kind of feeding into that concept of this is the type of data to collect to make your data useful, both for yourself in the future and also for data sharing and pooling with others. I think that's really, really helpful, especially if people wanting to utilize data standards such as, excuse me, such as CDISC. It is quite technical and it's hard to pick up. So having those ready for people to pick up without having to learn every single thing about CDISC, I think is really useful to provide that to the communities to be able to use. And so that's in place. We actually had an opportunity to collaborate with CDISC to annotate the existing SRX CRF, which was used to collect COVID data. And they helped to annotate that to the data collection standard CDASH and the data storage standard SDTM. And we've done similar things with other type of disease themes like VL and malaria and Ebola. So I think collecting data, well documented, already partially standardized data to begin with makes life much easier downstream.
So what you're saying is you're trying to standardize yourself out of a job. Is that?
Yes, I would like to be in that position where people think you just push a magic button and it all gets done. So eventually one day we'll get there, but yeah, not anytime soon.
So looking forward, I'm interested in each of your thoughts on technical developments or any developments in your focus of data collection, data aggregation, and analysis. So I'll ask you each for two things. One is a blue sky vision. So in a perfect world, what would your area look like? What tool would be available? What technology would be there? And then maybe tell us what you are working on. Might be a piece of that, might be something else. But what different technological developments is your group focused on? Can I ask Alex, can I ask you to start?
Okay, we Okay, the blue sky, this scenario for us is designed as a architecture of data where we can use in a common repository all the data perceived in the different information system of the organization, or if we can scale the region or the country, or maybe in the world, no? If it was possible. So we centralize, for example, in a data lake, all this data in the format that is recorded in the source information system, and then over this data lake that contains all the data relevant for, in this case, for secondary use, we can implement different pipelines of data to obtain different data outputs. For example, the specific CRF, SARIC, or H1n1, etc. Also, standardized repository, for example, H2B2 or OMO. Also, a clinical dashboard implemented to the manage of cohort of patients. And finally, for example, artificial intelligence application using this EHR data. So we now are working in the implementation of this data architecture in a project of the Madrid region that is called Infobanco. So it's a project that starts next year, or in the first month of the next year. So we hope that in 2 years maybe we achieve this blue sky. No? Now what are doing for the project? So we have implemented this process, but in a more pragmatic way, using, for example, a specific extraction of data for the projects, using data information systems in a ETL process, and also to implementing in this point ad hoc ETL process from the EHR to any specific data output model. But in the future, we hope that we can to systematize this kind of process and make more scalable in the organization.
I think that integration is going to be critical for global collaboration going forward. And I hope you'll have a discussion with Matthew, who I was speaking to in session 1. Will, can I hand to you for your blue sky and then real developments?
Blue sky, when you read a paper and you see the result in it and you see the number, you move your mouse over the number and it tells you where that came from, how it was derived, all the data source that fed into it. And there are kind of initiatives to move towards that. With CDISC, they have some traceability from data points back to predecessor data points and descriptions of how they were derived, and then tracing that back to the SDTM data, which is the data that's collected. And then when you come to electronic health records, you then have to have a way of referring back to those. It would be great if electronic healthcare data systems had a point-in-time architecture, so you could query them at a particular point in time in the past and get back exactly the same answer that you would have got at that time. So there are database architectures that permit you to do that. And then also, one of the things we're looking at is how do we describe the context and meaning of electronic healthcare data? How was it collected? What does it? Can we be sure that we've interpreted it correctly? Do we know what it means? And often there are quite lengthy data entry manuals for some of these systems, but we're often only interested in a few variables. And so finding the right bits of those manual and having maybe a standard template for describing parts of the data source that we've used and some of the properties of the data source, like what if there's a data lag, what the geographical coverage is, what are the reasons why some people might not be in it. You can imagine having a standard template that would capture those essential things.
I think that's an amazing view on provenance, which I'm sure that Miguel and Pablo Sinuelia will build into the model that they are developing. So, Alex, over to you.
Yeah, so a couple of things from the open safely perspective. The first is that open safely is intended to and designed to be installed or set up in in any electronic health record system. So as I said, we've already got it set up in two different electronic health record systems, TPP and EMIS in the UK, and we're sort of exploring other options. That's, I'm sure, going to be more challenging as we move into electronic health records in other countries where the data are sort of structured very differently and so on. But that's going to be a fun challenge. And then the other thing we're working on is sort of standardization of the way you define variables and the way you do the sort of data number crunching and or data management. So for example, standard ways of defining age, sex, ethnicity, we've sort of done quite a lot on, and then we're looking to extend that so that if you come to do a study, you can just sort of pick individual bits that have already been well defined and described and sort of checked so that you know exactly the advantage or disadvantage of using that particular variable. And then you can just plug those together and you get a much more standardized data set. And then also in terms of we're big fans of sort of modular bits of code that do specific things. So for example, I've been working on an individual matching script that takes some cases and it's quite common in sort of case control study design that you might do in an epidemiology study, and the intent of that is that people will just be able to specify the way they want matching to happen, and then you plug that into the analytic pipeline and you get the right numbers out. The challenge with that is describing it sufficiently well that people trust that it does what it says it does, and are willing to use that above their own script that they've written, that they know exactly how it works.
Well, I look forward to you having that in place. Kaylin, blue sky and future work?
So coming from the perspective of a group that aggregates disparate data to release for to data requesters, I think that in the future, what would be really great, and this might sound a bit controversial, is to be data standard agnostic. So we chose CDISC SDTM because we were mostly getting clinical trials, and that's a clinical trial standard. But no data standard is perfect. And with the observational data coming from COVID, it's, sometimes things are getting crammed in where they weren't necessarily meant to be. But when you think about it, the data it's not determined by the standard. So vital signs like temperature, temperature is temperature, whether it's in CDISC or OMAP or an electronic health record. And so what would be really great is if we could have all of our data in our repository in something called a biomedical concept. So the concept of temperature. So it's got the result, the unit, the time, the location, things like that. And then when people want to request the data, they could say, oh, I'm an observational health researcher and I really love OMAP, then we could pull it out in OMAP standard. Or if they want to combine it with clinical trial data, we can pull it out in CDISC. And so that concept is how we store the data. We store data about a temperature, but then we can pull it out into whatever type of standard that people want to use, because it's all about making generating new data, and so making it as easy for people to use as possible. Obviously, that's a massive project, so we have been doing some work. I know CDISC is doing a lot of work around biomedical concepts and that idea of defining, something like a diagnostic test and all of the data around it and things like that. So that's where I would like us to head one day.
Now, I know that Will is quite involved in the CDISC community, so I might just make a little bit of space for him to comment. And then Miguel, I wonder if this bleeds into your thoughts around interoperability. So we'll go to you for a comment. But Will, any thoughts on redesigning to enable CDISC and other data standards?
Yeah, I think that yeah, it's very difficult to come up with the general data standard or capture everything. We find the same with the SDTM standard, that it's often difficult to know where to put something, and sometimes you can't conform to the standard, and you have to document why you've done it differently. I think that I think it's more important that the data is well defined and well described than standardized. It's handy if it is standardized as far as possible, but that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is that it's well defined and well described.
Miguel, what are your thoughts on enabling interoperability in Kaylin's model of biomedical concepts?
Well, I think that, as I said the previous college, it's important that that clinical concepts are well defined and well modeled. And our next step is to standardize this concept using international standards. So I think that these heterogeneous sources, for example, this database or other, if you have the possibility into the source information system, this standard of it not possible because you doesn't govern the HR of your organization, but you can put the standards in the ETL process from point A to point B. You can combine data from different sources. If you apply this advanced standard, for example, as I said before, OpenAir or FIRE, or we are agnostic on the standard to apply. But I think that for different organizations, we have to go to a common framework to exchange data. If not, it's very difficult to base the process in local models. So if you select one standard that you prefer and you use clinical concepts, for example, ethnicity, law, etc., to apply the semantic of the clinical concept in this process of interoperability, you achieve the semantic interoperability, that is the more sophisticated level of interoperability. And you can combine data from different organizations without loss of meaning. So I think that this is the more important point.
I think that you and Will agree in many ways. Smitty, over to you.
Thank you. This has been a really engaging conversation. We do have one question in the Q&A, which I think might be interesting to address. We talked about a similar concept in our first panel. The question is specifically about funding and the need to be supported both by government and private funding sources. But I think it might be interesting to hear from this panel to talk about sustainability. In our first panel, we talked about the fact that a lot of the efforts that were being led by those panelists were made possible because of all the extra energy put towards the crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic. This panel is a little bit different in that there's a lot more existing frameworks that we built on to then respond to the pandemic. But I'd be interested to hear from these panelists about what does the sustainability look like as we move to a phase where COVID is endemic rather than being a pandemic, as we make sure that these infrastructures, these processes are in place, not only to address ongoing issues of other diseases that need to be studied, but also to be prepared for the next pandemic, which will come likely inside most of our careers. I'm not sure who to tag first for that. And that's kind of a big question, but it'd be very interesting to hear perspectives of this panel being not US centric.
So in my opinion, to make scalable this kind of project and to maintain this process and reutilization of EHR, the most important part is the team, the people. If you have a good team, you form these people and you can maintain this in the organization, you can to grow up in new projects and new implementation. So of course, for to have good people in your team, you need resources. So we start with a national project, public national project of Spain. For example, I start in the hospital as a researcher, and also Noelia start in the hospital as a researcher of funding of public funding of Spain. So now when we are growing up in more capacity, we also apply to other kind of projects. For example, we participate in Eden project, that is a IMI2 project that also give funding to implement your home repository, or other kind of project funding for industry, etc. So I think that if you want to grow up as a data science group or informatic medical group, you need this kind of resources to maintain the team. I think that is the more important, more than infrastructure or more than all information system, etc. I think that the team, the people, and that have the knowledge of apply this is fundamental.
Dr. Walker, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, so I think our experience at Open Safely is, it sounds like it would be familiar to the previous panel in that we started essentially just relying on energy because Open Safely didn't exist at all before March 2020. That was when we had our first meeting. Yeah, and since then we've received enough funding to sort of keep us going for the medium term. We've had some funding from sort of Wellcome Trust and some government funding sources. But yeah, the sort of long-term model, I think, is to be determined. And I know other suppliers of data sort of charge for like access to the data sort of when you apply. But yeah, at the moment, to use the Open Safely data, we don't charge individual users. Yeah, we're essentially funded by the sort of grants that we've got since starting.
Thank you. Dr. Stevens or Dr. Keenan, or Laura, I saw you unmuted.
I mean, just I work with Kaylin on one of her initiatives, so happy to make some comments there, because actually we're right in the middle of trying to develop a business model for a sustainable repository. I think, as Alex said, and Miguel alluded to as well, you can survive on research funding if you are continuously producing world-class research, and if you have sufficient support within those research funding to support the infrastructure. And to me, that's one of the difficult parts about data science, is there's often a huge volume of infrastructure, be that technical or legal or ethical, or all the background work that needs to happen in order to enable us to be able to access, use, analyze, disseminate all of those data. And so I do think that there's a need for a new funding model in repositories and in clinical research to help us all to work more efficiently and not focus on single sort of product-driven grants, which is frankly causing a waste of all that we pour into that infrastructure if it's not sustained in the longer term. So I think it's a great point from our audience and others that yes, it's definitely needed. So anyone who wants to write us a check is more than welcome to. I'll put my email address in the chat for you later.
Just to echo that nearly all of the funding we've had as a group has been for like individual research projects, and there's almost no funding available for building infrastructure.
I agree with that. So along those lines, what should we all be doing within our groups to work together, to work more efficiently? I mean, so much of what each of us is doing overlaps in interesting ways, though there's diversity, of course, in what everyone's doing. But either within this panel or nationally, globally, what sort of collaboration would you like to see that would enable research to be more efficient, more sustainable? Will, can I drop that question on you?
I think that coming from a computer science background and then working with the CDISC standards, which I think grew up more in the statistical programming background, there are definitely things that computer scientists could usefully input into the development of the CDISC data standards, where there's work on data modeling and I think biomedical concept work that Kaylin mentioned, and different ways of representing data, which I think it is now being communicated at CDISC interchanges and other conferences. So that I think could be really fruitful. People who are working on metadata modeling say that there's potentially a lot of useful input that could be had there.
I completely agree from an infrastructure perspective. And I'll also point out that, of course, CDISC is a voluntary organization. I mean, they rely on volunteers like yourself who are willing to put in the time to develop those standards. So I wonder if there aren't different models of funding that can support that. But I completely agree on the utility of all of that infrastructure that CDISC is developing. Miguel and colleagues, what are your thoughts on efficiencies, on collaboration, on what we need to do going forward?
Well, as we have seen in this panel, one of the main requirements for collaboration among organizations are the use of standards, both in the information system, but also in the terminology used. And this will allow us to collaborate in a more efficient way and also in a rapid way. So yeah, the use of a standard as the main focus.
Kaylin, do you want to agree or disagree? Or extend?
Standards is always good, helps people understand what other people are talking about without all of that kind of background reading and figuring out. So definitely, yeah.
Alex, do you want to add anything? Any different things we should be working on?
I suppose slightly separate, but just sharing code generally is always useful to, so people can reuse it and use exactly the same methods as other people have.
So I'm going to very generously and broadly apply the term of open science to that you've just expressed. What are you doing in open science? What is your group doing? What direction do you want to head in? And what are you not willing to make available?
So the Open Safely Collaborative shares all of the analytic code. If you go to GitHub/OpenSafely, then you'll see all of the code for all of the studies that we've published. One exception to that is for studies that we're currently working on, we usually keep them private, just because often researchers prefer to keep things secret until they reveal all of the work. And in fact, within Open Safely itself, it's impossible to run any of your code on the real data unless you've actually committed it to the GitHub repo. So it's sort of a mandatory thing to, if you want to use it, you have to accept that it's going to be shared.
I think those researchers would argue that everything is a secret until it's revealed. But you're right, there's always things that are being held back. Will, what's the recovery approach to transparency, sharing, openness? What's recovery doing?
So our data is going to be available for researchers to request. I think one of the complicating factors here is getting data sharing agreements with the people who put the data with NHS Digital, and making sure that we fully described what we're doing with the data, how it will be anonymized before being shared, and then making sure that the processes, the governance processes for dealing with requests and then sharing the data are robust.
And in addition to data sharing, what else is Recovery making available?
We will be publishing methods. That's we've been very busy publishing results. We've also got methodology work that we've done that we're to write up and publish in the future as well, describing the workflows that we've used and the issues we encountered and how they were solved.
Yeah, when time allows. Kaylin, what's your team doing on access, open access, transparency?
So this kind of feeds into your question about collaboration as well. And I think just speaking from when we first went on our kind of CDIS journey and every other kind of journey, I think we were, reinventing the wheel like a lot of groups did. And I think what would be nice is some type of way to better engage with people who are already doing this kind of thing. So like the whole ETL system that Miguel and his group are doing, that took a lot of work. I'm sure that other groups would love to know how to do that. And I feel like there's not a really great way to put people in touch and to really, talking about sustainability, if you don't have to pay somebody to figure out over 3 years, how to do something, you can learn from others and, build on what other groups have learned. That would be really helpful because you wouldn't have to start from scratch. And so, all the stuff that we've learned about data sharing and governance and ethics and, terms of submission and all that kind of nitty gritty governance stuff, happy to share that with others, let them see, let them learn. And just, I think every group has a great idea and they're like, all right, we have to start from scratch and build it. And so there's a lot of replication that happens, and just, it would be nice to see a way for people to collaborate a bit more closely and not have that academics kind of instinct to say everything is mine, I can't share, and just making it more open for everybody.
Well, I'd say that Miguel and his team have served as a very good example of that, sharing their methods, sharing their data. Do you have anything else you want to add about transparency?
Yes, of course, as I said before, panelists, data open science is fundamental if we want to improve the data process and not replicate the same effort in different organizations. So as you said before, we have published our methodology in the paper that you know as open access paper. So of course, if some group need more information about how we are implement that, of course, can talk with us and we will happy to help. So in addition to the paper, we also have published as Creative Commons our data information models and archetypes. So any organization can go to this registry and download our models and implement in the information system of the organization. And also we have a GitHub of the data area of the hospital where we publish the ETL process from different specific secondary use models. So also it can be reused for any organization that want to implement this kind of automatic process from EHR to a specific data model, for example, ISARIC or other. So I think what we are very transparent in our in our resources.
Appreciate it. So there's a question in the chat about repurposing candidates, which I know is an objective of CDRC. So maybe, Smitty, can I ask you to say a few words about CDRC and that effort, and then we can think about when and how we tie into that.
Absolutely. So as our name implies, the Cure Drug Repurposing Collaboratory does focus on identifying drugs that are candidates for repurposing. Marco can rattle off the difference in the number of diseases that are identified versus the number of drugs, and there's a huge mixed match, especially around emerging diseases or rare diseases where we have situations where we have a condition or a disease with no approved treatment. Oftentimes there's, as we've discussed in previous sessions of this meeting, There are standards of practice that don't include any, that are completely off-label treatments. And our aim is to use real-world evidence, real-world data to try to not only identify potential agents to generate some hypotheses about those treatments, but also ultimately to try to create ways that we can use some observational data to help inform the labeling of medications, which there is a pathway to do so in Europe and in the UK, but there's not such a pathway in the United States as of yet. I think the major benefit of all these collaborations, especially internationally, is that we can learn from each other how we're handling this data, understand shortcomings of this data so we don't put too much stake in it, but we do maximize the potential of leveraging this kind of data to understand how drugs are already being repurposed and which drugs need to be investigated more substantially through, for example, through randomized control trials or platform trials.
So I'll just make one comment on that from the perspective of the ISRIC patient registry or database. And that's that, no, that's not the objective of the data collection that is being done globally on COVID-19. And I'd argue that observational data collection, of course, isn't the #1 way that we're going to go looking for drugs. And I think Will's colleagues could say some words about the drugs that they are testing. And there's a dozen now, I think, Will, that are being tested or have been tested within the recovery platform. And so there's different ways to identify what the priority treatments should be. But what ISARIC has managed to do is to identify trends in treatment. So we find around the world, there's different drugs being used, different amounts of drugs being used, and for different patients. And so one thing that we did notice is that the use of steroids and dexamethasone in particular within certain patient populations skyrocketed after the introduction of the recovery evidence. And so we can see what people are doing, learn from that, and maybe drive hypotheses of what might be productive or not. But Alex, is that something within GP records that would be something you could look for? What are GPs using and prescribing? And how would you use that information?
Yeah, so we can certainly look at drugs that have been prescribed to people and what happens to those people afterwards. I think that the challenge with pharmacoepidemiology in observational data like this is bias, and very often it's almost impossible to remove all of that bias. So I think the value of looking at drug use in this kind of data is broadly with hypothesis generation rather than hypothesis testing. There are occasions where you can get a bit closer to finding causal relationships and so on, but it's very dependent on the drugs. You know, but very often, even if you're looking at different drugs within a drug class, there are different indications for those drugs, and therefore the patient populations that get the different kinds of drugs are different, and that's and you can obviously do statistical adjustment to try and remove those effects, but getting all the way to removing it entirely is a huge challenge.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. As we get to the top of the hour, I'm going to ask each of you just to choose one thing that you want to mention to reinforce to those who are listening, either about the work that you're doing or some of the topics that we've brought up today. So whatever you'd like to do, and Miguel, Noelia, Pablos, if it's okay, maybe we will start with you. What's your one take-home message for everyone today?
First, thank you for inviting us to be here today. And as message, I think that this panel demonstrates that we different points in Europe and also in the world are doing very interesting things around health data. And if we collaborate and we use, as I say, for standards, and we produce open science, we can do amazing things in the reusing of the EHR for secondary use and make more efficient, more agile the research of COVID-19 and other conditions. So I think that we now have to talk with our colleagues of this panel and all the attendees that are interested in our presentation and to make things together.
Thanks for that, Miguel. I agree completely. Kaylin, can I hand to you next?
Sure. Just, I think a takeaway, especially as you know, as a group that promotes data sharing and data reuse, that people out there are generating lots of great data. They're willing to share that data. There are people out there putting forth great efforts to standardize and make that data usable and available. And so just, you know, take that lesson from all of these groups. Like Laura mentioned before, there's 1,700 sites for ASARIC that agreed to share data. So there's lots of people out there. So bring all the data together and you know, make it available. That's the big takeaway.
Agreed. Will, I know that you're bringing a lot of data together and making it available. Do you want to give a closing message?
Yeah, I was going to say, with regard to complexity, keep things as simple as possible, focus on the important things. And I think for us, the main thing we learned from working on platform trial is how important thinking about workflows and version control is.
Yeah, agree. Alex, over to you.
I'm going to shamelessly plug OpenSafely again. So if you go to opensafely.org, you can read more about the sort of privacy advantages and the open science advantages of the platform. And if you're interested in either coming to use the data or having OpenSafely set up in your data set, then come and ask us.
That sounds great. Smitty, you're last on the list.
I think it's the most important takeaway is that we need to continue these conversations. We have in all of our panels today, from all of our panelists, we have different approaches, and I think we continuing to learn from each other. We can create better models to leverage the data that's already there, augment that data in with other data sources, and provide the best possible evidence that we can, the best possible real-world evidence.
I agree completely that with all of you, that the best evidence is going to come from generosity, from keeping it simple, from global collaboration, and from making good use of the resources that are there. And each of you and your organizations is a great example of that. So huge thanks to all of you for your time, for your sharing your expertise and participating today. It was an absolute pleasure. And thank you, Smitty and QRID for having us. I hope we can do it again sometime.
Thanks, Laura.
Thanks.
And this is definitely, you know, the first volley in communication cycle. We'd love to be able to do this again. I thank all the panelists, and especially you, Laura, for helping moderate this session. This session is actually being recorded, and we'll make all the recordings for all the sessions available on our website. I think that it would probably be next week, but it may take another few more days after that. So it would be available soon, and we'll send the registrants an email letting everyone know what's available or not. So more to come. Thank you very much. Great job, everyone. Have a great day.